quote unquote, Jesus is the best attested historical person in the first century.
Well, we better wise up and just start listening then. I'm just kidding.
Is the evidence really that good for Jesus Christ? You tell me. But my research tells me so much theology is there, it's difficult to discern history from the theology. Unless we have an outside source that can validate and verify what we're trying to look at, instead of trying to use the internal arguments of the internal arguments. Anyway, John Gleason, who's a YouTube creator, he's going to join us today at our MythVision podcast. Be sure to go down in the description, get a hold of his YouTube channel, subscribe to his channel, check out his stuff because he does stuff similar to what I do. Also, he has an app. I want every one of you guys to check out this app. He's been working with Dr. Richard Carrier on creating a way of making information easily accessible. You don't have to click a YouTube video to get all this information. You don't have to open a PDF on your phone, and I don't know if you know how difficult that is when you're trying to look through for information. There's an app called Crestus that he has, and he's been working with Dr. Carrier, where all these arguments, external, extra biblical, internal evidences, all these little things that historicists will throw at you as a mythicist, he's gone through peer-reviewed material and making sure you have the top-notch information. He updates it regular and everything. Check out this commercial. Make sure you guys subscribe. Hit that bell, don't forget, so you're notified. Like this video so YouTube puts MythVision higher on the algorithm so we can grow, and comment because they look for that too. And let me know what you think of this discussion today. Thanks a lot for showing us at MythVision your love.
If you're interested in the history of early Christianity, then consider downloading the Crestus app, available on Google Play and the App Store. Crestus uses peer-reviewed sources to give you the most up-to-date scholarship on historical claims for and against Jesus. Download today to find out why the historical sources for Jesus Christ don't support his existence.
We are MythVision. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Your host, Derek Lambert, here at MythVision Podcast. I have somebody really cool I want you guys to meet. If you haven't met him yet, you're going to need to go down in the description. He's got a YouTube channel called Godless Engineer, and he talks about some of the stuff we talk about here and a lot more stuff. So welcome to the show, John.
Hi, thanks for having me. We've been trying to set this up for a while, so I'm really glad that we were able to get like a time down for us to actually, talk.
Same here, brother, because you and me share a lot in common on skepticism. I mean, we really are skeptical on the approach that people have been taking on the New Testament. And, I'm not denying there could have been a Jesus, as these scholars have been pointing out. But really, is the evidence that great?
I mean, I would say no, but I've had a lot of conversations where my opponents are obviously of the mindset that, quote unquote, Jesus is the best attested historical person in the first century.
Well, we better wise up and just start listening then. I'm just kidding. No, I mean, this is like, it's kind of funny, man, because as soon as they say that, and I go, okay, if imagine us circulating, and I mentioned this on another show, we just circulate some Paul Bunyan literature, or let's find as much as we can on Osiris. I bet you there was a lot that has been lost over time about Osiris, and you have to scratch your head and wonder, what do we not have? Could we have made the same arguments they're making about Osiris? He was the most attested ancient Egyptian god, and we know that he existed, even though we deny the miraculous of him. Well, how do you know this? So there's so many things to ask yourself. But what are some of the oppositions you've dealt with? Because you actually do open debate. I actually just host people who are scholars, and I'm kind of like a student, so to speak, who's trying to learn. What are some of the things you notice that kind of just make you go, gosh, I got to repeat myself on this again? Talk to us.
Well, so, I mean, there are pretty common arguments, obviously. There's common objections like the Josephus passage, the Testimonium Flavianum, plus the James passage. Those are pretty popular. Tacitus is pretty popular. I'm actually pretty, I think that there's a bigger discussion on not Tacitus, but on Josephus, like there's a better discussion to be had there. But Tacitus, I get that feeling every time Tacitus is brought up that, it's like, oh God, we got to go through this again. Because for Tacitus, you don't really have a link to a historical Jesus. And that's even if you take it at face value of Tacitus actually referencing Christ in the passage. All you have is saying, oh, there were Christians in Rome during the burning of Rome in 64 CE. And so whenever they bring up that particular argument, like, oh, well, Tacitus, he's trusted by his historians to give a good account of Jesus. And it's like, no, if you critically look at it, it has no link to a historical Jesus whatsoever.
Yeah, I've been looking at this for a minute. I just had Lena Einhorn on the show. Now, she's not a mythicist, but she does a darn good job showing issues, right? She shows in her book A Shift in Time where the Gospels don't match. And this isn't just Jesus. I mean, one can go, well, where is Jesus? Anybody can try and say, we don't know, because there's no contemporaneous writings that kind of support it. But there are contemporaneous writings that support the ideas of where some of the major figures who are even like high priest of Israel, or, obviously Caesars, or like Herod, etc. These guys are obvious historical characters. The problem is Josephus puts them in the 50s and the 60s. And here these guys are looking under Pontius Pilate. So when you have a quote from someone like Tacitus or Suetonius or something, and you start running into this, well, he was under Pontius Pilate, that doesn't line up with Josephus. If you're looking at this historically, there's so many mistakes and issues that start occurring. And it just makes me wonder what we're missing and what happened. Did church fathers really tamper with this stuff? And you went right to the heart by saying the Testimonium Flavinium, but I guess I watched your T-Jump debate recently, and he wasn't aware of some of these things. I get what he's saying and where he's coming from, but he wasn't aware of thinking of it in that critical way. It sounds like a lot of people aren't.
Well, no, I would say that T-Jump, and I don't mean this in a derogatory manner at all, but T-Jump heavily relies on consensus. But the problem with the discussion is that if you're going to appeal to consensus, it's not going to be convincing, and it doesn't actually prove that Jesus existed in history, because mythicists in general are challenging the consensus. We're saying, no, you're wrong about this evidence. It actually doesn't mean what you say it means. And so then you have the apologists that come back with, oh, well, the consensus says. And so the problem is that I'm attacking the consensus while they're sticking to the consensus, but you can't use the consensus to argue for the consensus.
I can sense this conversation. I'm just teasing. So the Testimonium Flavinium, what's interesting about that passage, there's only two. One obvious, anyone can say. And let me ask you this. The Testimonium Flavinium, which is an obvious quote that church fathers had to have, even like liberal Christians will agree, and probably even some more fundamentalists might even come on and say, well, okay, we got to admit this guy wasn't probably a Christian. But I've heard Christians who say, look, he just didn't want to get, killed, and he was a Christian. Like, there's Christians that have that idea. Do you think it's wholeheartedly added in there? Like there wasn't a possible original that wasn't about Jesus, or do you think there was?
So, we're talking about the Testimonium Flavianum. I think that it was completely inserted, and I have a lot of reasons why I think this. Well, for one thing, like one of the biggest things is that in interpolations, one thing that you look for is whether or not you can take out that particular portion and then everything else flows seamlessly around it. And the problem with the testimonium is that if you take out the testimonium, then the paragraph preceding it flows seamlessly into the paragraph that comes after it. And I've heard recently the argument that, well, this Josephus's where the testimonium appears in Josephus's work is a digression or something like that. So there's a lot of patchwork stuff in it. And so it makes sense that if you took out this one particular section, then everything else would be fine because it's a digression or something. But see, the problem with that is that not only does the paragraph before the testimonium flow seamlessly into the paragraph after it, the paragraph after the testimonium references the paragraph before the testimonium, as if it was just now talked about. So it doesn't make sense to say, well, if you take that out, then it still flows seamlessly because it's a digression. You have this problem of the paragraph after it referencing the first paragraph, and you're not actually explaining anything by calling it a digression. But there's that, but also a lot of people like to say that the testimonium has the redacted versions that are actually earlier versions of it. But Alice Wheatley has actually shown that that's not true. All versions of the Testimonium Flavianum, whether redacted or not, come from Eusebius. And so Eusebius is our first instance of it actually being referenced. And the problem with that is, and a lot of people like to go, oh, well, that's just an argument from silence because nobody used the testimonium before that. The problem is that Origen wrote Contra Celsus way before Eusebius, where he actually references Josephus and the particular work that the testimonium appears in. I think that's what is it? It's not the Jewish Wars. It's the Antiquities of the Jews is where it's at. Origen specifically references that work by Josephus in defense of the historicity of his faith. And he doesn't ever mention the Josephus passage or the passage later about James. He references neither of them. So it's very peculiar that a church father who had possession of the very same texts wouldn't reference this particular passage in a work that he was already citing to defend the historicity of his faith. Kind of seems like he would use that particular source when you're countering somebody. So it doesn't make a lot of sense, like the silence of everybody on the testimonium prior to Eusebius, and then the fact that we only have Eusebius's version of it. All of these things, it's never just one thing. And that's one thing that historicists often like to misrepresent, that it's like just, oh, this one thing means that it's interpolated or inserted. And it's like, no, it's not one thing. It's a culmination of all of these things that have no explanation for them other than it was completely inserted. But even then, if you wanted to take it at face value that Josephus wrote it, the way that he structures that entire paragraph and also the way he uses verbs in that paragraph are completely different than all of the other Josephine text. And all of this is peer-reviewed scholarship on Josephus. So at that point, generally what I find is that people will be like, oh, well, it doesn't matter if it's a peer-reviewed position, or it doesn't matter this or that. I've come across that. Or people won't even read like the opposition argument to it. They just hear the consensus, they believe it, and then they use the consensus to argue for it. But the problem is that they're not actually like critically considering everything about the testimonium. They're not critically considering every reason behind it. And just recently I had a conversation with a Converse contender on the issue of the historicity of Jesus. And it got to the point where he was like, well, you just don't want him to be a historical figure. And that I would say is one of the most frustrating things.
I can totally get where you're coming from, man. I'm sure a lot of people who watch my stuff probably feel the same way. No, I would be fascinated if I found out who he really was. Like, actually, because I've had some serious people come on here and that have explained who they really believe based on their research. And none of them are believers, but who they really believe was Jesus. And we've got people from a rebel, obviously like a rebel leader who's militant, to Jesus being the magician, to Jesus being the Egyptian, which that's another character, Judah the Galilean, being possibly Jesus, Jesus being Ananias, Jesus being a Frankenstein character of other historical characters. And then, of course, you've got your celestial angelic with Dr. Price and Dr. Carrier. And you actually are working hand in hand with Dr. Carrier. And I wanted to mention that because you guys got to see at the intro of the video, the Crestus app, all these questions and ideas that we're talking about here, he updates it frequently, but you guys get that app. I can't emphasize that enough. You guys need to get it because all these ideas, if you really want to know, are there. They're all there, and him and Dr. Carrier are working on this together. So I agree with that whole argument. It sucks for us because we're fighting an uphill battle because it's hard to disprove someone's existence. It's impossible to disprove, but we can give good reason to doubt and good sufficient reason to not agree that there was. And I mean, even going into the Pauline literature and all this stuff, like we have a lot of reasons to think this is a spiritual guy, not necessarily, it looks like a later euhemerized version of something. So,
right.
But go ahead, brother. Anything.
Well, I was just going to caution everybody on trying to disprove his existence in particular, because what you want to do is we've got this hypothesis that Jesus was just a celestial figure that was not necessarily created whole cloth, but that the Jews initially believed in and then eventually became historicized. What you need to focus on is trying to find information that could potentially prove that hypothesis wrong, because in science, you don't look for information that supports your idea. You actually look for information that could potentially prove your idea wrong. And you end up finding evidence that supports your idea, but that's probably because your idea is the correct idea. So what you need to do is you need to find evidence that could potentially break the mythicist hypothesis. And that's what like Dr. Carrier has tried to do. And he, of course, came out as a mythicist because he started off thinking that Jesus was a historical figure. And then he tried looking into the information and tried to find solid evidence that would indicate that he was a historical figure, and he just didn't find any. And that's exactly what I found too. I thought he was a historical figure. I figured we had just as much evidence for Jesus as like Pilate and everything else that happened. I totally believe that. And then I went looking for the evidence, and all I found were really bad arguments that suggest that Jesus existed. And these arguments, though, like the criteria is only used in like historical studies for Jesus. Like they have their own special set of criteria that they use to prove that Jesus exists that is not applicable in other portions of history.
That's interesting. I've heard the arguments, and I watched the debate with Dr. Price and Dr. Ehrman. Ehrman approached it, I felt, he did a better job debating, okay, in terms of how he debated, in the sense of his way of presenting it. But see, a lot of people miss some of the things I think Dr. Bob said, and he didn't speak as clearly as I say maybe Dr. Carrier could have if he was on that show. Not speaking ill. I mean, like Dr. Price is like a grandpa figure to me in terms of this stuff. He comes on the show, and we constantly do shows all the time, but I would love to see that debate. And one of the issues I kept hearing Ehrman do was the overwhelming amount of literature on this man, and like things that I'm like, do you really have to say that? I mean, like, look, we can argue over these Eusebius or different people saying different things. Did you really have to say because of the overwhelming literature that's evidence? And he used things like that. Then he compared Jesus to Caesar, Augustus. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So there's evidence. Do you have that on the app as well?
Yes, we actually do. It's in a section called precedents, and I'm actually working on expanding that section right now. We have multiple different historical figures that are commonly used in comparison to Jesus, and basically throughout the app, this is an update that's coming out, but throughout this particular section where we compare other historical figures, we have like what arguments being made, and then the simplest rebuttal to it, that why it's not convincing, and then we have an extended section that is like more information on it if you want more specific information. So for like Julius Caesar, let's say, we have different archaeological evidence in the form of inscriptions, coins, engraved letters, and decrees and stuff like that. We also have mundane kind of papyri, where they're like land agreements or rental agreements or something like that, where they date it in the name of the current reigning emperor. And that happens across multiple different historical figures across time, but any one of them that you want to compare it to. So really what they basically do, though, is they're comparing Jesus to a person that's outside the reference class that Jesus is in, because Jesus is very specific. He's a charismatic leader that would have gathered a following and been convincing to at least a good number of people for them to continue his religion after he supposedly died, and then it grew into one of the world's leading religions. So we're not talking about the mundane, backwards, hillbilly boy that like Bart Ehrman, as well as other apologists out there that just repeat Bart Ehrman, like to make him out to be. Because it's regardless of what area he came from, still, the claim is that he was influential enough to be able to start a religion and it continue after he died. That is a very specific reference class. You would be hard-pressed to find anybody in history that would match that reference class that actually existed. Because like for Mormonism, you have John Smith and then the angel Moroni, right? In Islam, you have Muhammad and then the angel Gabriel, which I think that there's some kind of discussion being had on whether or not Muhammad actually existed. I haven't looked into the historicity of Muhammad, but just for the sake of this particular conversation, let's assume that Muhammad existed. Muhammad would have been synonymous with Paul, and of course the angel Gabriel would have been synonymous with Jesus. And so really that's what we have evidence for, is Paul getting hallucinations and reading the scriptures. And that's all the evidence that Christianity has. It's hard to really build a good historical case off of just that.
I had a really good show earlier today I did with Dr. Price on some of this stuff, but it was actually Joseph Smith. You were talking about John Smith, Joseph Smith.
Sorry. I meant Joseph Smith.
Yeah, no biggie.
Yeah, it was definitely not the guy who knocked up Pocahontas.
Well, if you're watching this, we apologize to our Mormon fellow friends here watching this. Anyways, I totally agree with you, man. I think there's too much that's not really understood. And I think what gets me, if you look at like Paul's very theology, okay, his theology is spiritual, like hardcore. Even his resurrection appears to be a spiritual one, not a physical one. Even in 1 Corinthians 15, when you get into the argument about the whole new seed, like a whole new body, it's not the same one type stuff. Then you watch this Jesus resurrect. I actually did this the other day in a Christian group on Facebook. I'm like, I'm just a wolf in sheep's clothing, but oh well. And and these guys are talking, and I'm like, do you believe, because these are guys who are called preterists, they believe that the end happened, like it actually did happen in the first century. So technically Christ kept his words. He did resurrect the dead. He did this. And I said, do you believe that Jesus physically rose from the dead? Number one. And do you believe that the saints also rose from the dead? Because they're supposed to rise from the dead the same way Jesus rose. And so I'm like catching him, like I'm like tricking him a little bit, but long story short, he's like, yeah, but physical bodies don't walk through walls. Like he's trying to say, well, Jesus may not be physical. And I'm like, hey, good job, buddy. And then his friend comes like, yeah, but he was walking on water not too long ago while he was still alive. So, and it's like, dude, guys, when are you going to draw the line that this is a story? But
Yeah.
they took what I think was spiritual and orthodoxy, the different versions of Christianity that took over, started putting more physical attributes. Like the idea of physical resurrection comes from the Jews. And this mystery school cult probably never had any intention on teaching that kind of view. Yet later, they start strapping it into history in a more, I guess you'd say, a Jewish way in some sense. What do you think?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, definitely, because the first Christians were actually Jewish Christians, and when they started historicizing Jesus, you didn't really have any kind of discussions on circumcision. I don't think. And in Mark, Jesus is definitely advocating for people following like the law of Moses. It was very like Paul and Mark, while they did have some new ideas for their religion, I want to say that they followed pretty well with like Jewish customs and stuff. I don't know.
I know Paul, if I'm not mistaken, he appeared before the other people, especially in Acts, that he was, but he talks crap, man. I mean, he literally talks about just cut the whole penis off if you start circumcising, like, and he literally talks in a way that I'm not saying because it's back and forth. This is why I like entertaining Dr. Bob's theory on Paul. Dr. Bob believes it's patchwork. He doesn't buy the 7 authentic. He thinks that, he like goes deeper in saying, hey, listen, you're trusting these 7 too much. Even in like these 7 in Galatians, he says chapter 1 and 2 are doing something completely different than 3, 4, 5, and 6. And he could show like contradictions he had a book, The Colossal Apostle, where he shows issues in Paul's own writings, like almost like later Christians started to change stuff, or they wanted to make an argument that was valid during the time. So they took Paul's letter and made Paul say it, you know what I mean? And for whatever reason, Paul had a serious name, and there's some weight to his name, just like Peter, I suspect. So I don't know.
Well, I mean, there are portions where it has been interpolated in Paul's writing, like in the mainstream scholarship. I do know that like right now there's currently the 7 authentic epistles, and then there's what is it? I think there's like 2 that are kind of disputed as to whether or not they're authentic, and then there's the 3 pastoral epistles that are definitely not written by Paul. But that's an interesting idea from Price. Right now, I mean, I haven't really looked into Price's argument, so I can't say whether or not that's true. I think that for like, in order to support the mythicist argument, though, you can totally take Paul at his word as being the author of the 7. And that's one thing that a lot of people don't understand is like, well, for the sake of argument, or accepting this just for proving a point, a lot of people think that you're being contradictory or whatnot whenever you do that. But I think that accepting that Paul wrote the 7 epistles that he's attributed to, that he can authentically say that he wrote, I think is perfectly fine for like a mythicist argument. I don't think that you got to go Price's route in order to argue for that. Although it's interesting.
Yeah.
I'll have to look into it.
I agree. And it's something just on a side note worthy of looking into. But the idea that you have shown in your recent debate with like T-Jump and others that you talk about, referencing Jesus, I mean, if you do count Acts, let's just say you do, he's never met this guy. So this is some interesting stuff. It's, I mean, did he learn it from a person? He claims he didn't, but then again, he said he is not a liar either. So it's hard to know whether Paul's telling. I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there.
I really wish that worked in court. You just get up on the stand like, look, I didn't do it, and I'm not a liar. Oh, well, shit, I guess he's not guilty.
Oh, man, that's good. That's good, man. Yeah. Dr. Carrier, I'm trying to get on the show again, man. He's hard, dude. He's hard to get a hold of for me to be able to do. I can write him anytime, but to get him to come on the show would be cool. If I had you and him come join and we have a hangout and talk about some stuff, I think it would be great because he goes into the angel stuff. How convinced are you that this is an angel? The same manner that like Dr. Carrier, are you pretty convinced of his argumentation?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very convinced of Carrier's position. Everything that I've read from Carrier seems to make logical sense. So the angel thing is that Paul never considered Jesus to actually be a person on earth, that he was always an angel. Even if he took on a body of flesh, he still did it as an angel. And the support for this, comes in various, portions or verses of Paul's work. Namely, one of the big things that connects them is I forget which verse it is, but it's where he talks about the archons of this aeon crucifying Jesus. And that's actually a pretty ambiguous term to use there because you can't tell who he's talking about exactly, because he could be talking about demons and Satan. And then the other possibility is that he's talking about Romans. But the Romans part doesn't really make a lot of sense because, of course, Romans weren't ruling the world at that time. And it's also a very weird phrase to use in order to reference Romans. He could have just said Romans. Why did he say the rulers of this world or archons of this aeon, right? Meanwhile, you have other sects of Christians out there that wrote down their ideas about the Christ, which would have included the ascension of Isaiah, which has Jesus descending from the upper heavens to the lower heavens and being crucified by Satan and his demons in the lower heavens. And the lower heavens would contain carbon copies of everything that you find here on earth. So if there's crucifixions going on down here on earth, then there's definitely crucifixions going on in the lower heavens. And if Satan and his demons would have known what would happen when they crucified this one guy, then they wouldn't have done it. That's one particular argument that I believe that Paul makes in his writing. And so I think that everything in Paul that could possibly reference a human version of Jesus, like an earthly version of Jesus, is too ambiguous to say whether or not he actually is talking about that. And considering that Paul completely separates himself from any kind of earthly source for Jesus, like in Galatians 1:11, I think that it's very, very probable that he only considered Jesus to be some kind of celestial figure who had a body that was made out of Davidic flesh. However God does that. I mean, he's God. He can literally conjure up some David seed and, create a body,
Right.
for, his pre-existent angel son, Jesus.
Well, you know the story of Abraham. I mean, in Abraham, you have God coming down with two angels, literally walk up to Abraham's tent, and Abraham is pretty much confronted by God and two angels, Yahweh and two angels. And this is this is a person. I mean, this is like, okay, hey, you look like a guy, this is God and his angels. Here you are coming to me, and I'm talking with you. Hey, will you see that place, Sodom and Gomorrah? That thing's going down. Will you do it if there's yet 50 righteous, Lord? Nope, not if there's 50. What about 45? No, 35, 40. It goes down all the way down. It's just funny. God appears to people, and they have no problem with that. But then they have places where it's like, no one could see the face of God and live. It's like, what's going on here, dude? And then God does not repent, but he repents. And he doesn't change his mind, but he changes his mind sometimes, And so it's tough, man. It's tough to say.
It's definitely odd. Sorry, I think my camera crapped out there for a second.
I think it's God trying to tell us something, bro. Stop talking crap, dude.
But yeah, I think that Paul really only has a concept of a celestial Jesus and not so much an earthly Jesus. I mean, another big indication of that is that he never talks about Jesus's like earthly life here, and all the information that he gets about Jesus comes from a celestial Jesus. So like I know a lot of people like to cite the Last Supper when Paul talks about the Last Supper, but he never really speaks about it as if other people were there, right? He never really talks about it as if like all of the disciples were there, because I mean he never references any disciples in any of his work. And so when he talks about the Last Supper, he doesn't reference anything that's found in the Gospels other than the ritual. So the Last Supper is really just about the ritual that they're supposed to be doing now instead of the previous Yom Kippur ritual. And so that's the purpose of the Last Supper in Paul's writings, is to replace Yom Kippur and all these animal sacrifices. And that was the point of Jesus in general, was to replace all of that with his sacrifice.
Dude, I found something recently in my show. These people on my show have heard me say it multiple times, but I think you'll like it. Dr. Bob actually wrote an article on it with me. It's Osiris, Joseph, and Jesus. And this whole mystery school thing that Dr. Carey and Dr. Bob are talking about, fascinating stuff. They utilized, of course, Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures, and yet still had their own little mystery school stuff going on. So what we see in like the story of Joseph, this goes right into like the Gospels, or even works with Paul here for the Last Supper possibly. What we have is Joseph's being sold by Judah, the brother Judah. At the time, it wasn't considered the nation yet. I mean, according to the narrative, it's just one guy so far. But he sells off Joseph, coat of many colors, gets taken, I think it's Amalekites. I don't know, some other Ammonites, you know. They take him down to Egypt in Potiphar's house. Potiphar and his wife like wants to sleep with him. And he's like, look, you're busted, bitch. I'm not doing this. And then, no, I'm just kidding. He starts to run out. She grabs his towel and it looks like he raped her. So now they throw him in the dungeon. He's in charge of this dungeon. Two guys have dreams. The guy's all a wine bearer, and then there's a baker. Both of them have dreams, and he tells them, let me tell you your dreams. God has given me the gift. Sure enough, the baker gets decapitated by the third day, and his head's resting on a pole, and the fowls of the air have to come eat his flesh. The wine bearer, he gets reinstated to the right hand of Pharaoh, or not the right hand, but like working for Pharaoh again. And when the wine bearer goes to leave the dungeon, he tells him, dude, don't forget about me. Don't forget about me. Now, listen to this correlation. Baker, bread, wine bearer, wine. There's the body and the blood. And he tells the wine bearer, don't forget about me. Do this in remembrance of me, Jesus said. And so it's clearly like this strange connection to Joseph's story and the dungeon and resurrecting, because Joseph goes through I guess you'd say the dungeon, hell, or death, or Hades, whatever you want to call it, and comes back. And he's seated at the right hand of Pharaoh, whereas Jesus is claimed to be seated at the right hand of God. If Paul's quoting anything, he could be finding this Jesus right here with Joseph. He could literally be finding the whole story from the Old Testament, and it didn't have to be a guy on earth.
Well, yeah. So in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, Paul says that according to the scriptures, these things happened, right? And so I think I'm fairly certain that he would have gotten his information like about Jesus and the theology surrounding Jesus from the Old Testament and these visions that he was having. Regardless of whether or not those visions actually happened, or if he was actually having hallucinations where I guess Jesus was talking to him, his version of Jesus was talking to him. Regardless of whether or not those actually happened, I definitely think that he pulled a lot of his information from the Old Testament. But I can't really say where in the Old Testament he got his information. He could have gotten it outside of the traditionally like messianic texts, like Daniel and Isaiah and Zechariah. But I think that you'd be hard pressed to say directly that he got like it from like the story of Joseph, although there are a lot of common themes in Joseph's story with Jesus's story, at least in the Gospels, because the Gospels also cite scripture in order to ground their particular version of all these things in what was already known to the Jews at the time, which would be the scriptures. So I'm not exactly sure about the connection between Joseph and Paul's Jesus, but I will say that Paul definitely got his information from the Old Testament as far as information about Jesus, and the Gospels definitely did that as well.
Jumping over to another spot, what do you do with the Talmud? People always go, well, come on, the Talmud's obvious reference to Jesus. What do you do with that?
So the Talmud is interesting because every time I hear the Talmud being brought up, I'm genuinely surprised people even bring it up. Because the Jesus that's actually mentioned in the Talmud does not match even story-wise with what we have for in the Gospels or even in Paul, right? But another thing is that there's a lot of scholarship done on this particular Jesus that's in the Talmud, and it's been shown that this Jesus actually existed under what was it, like King Jannaeus? I don't know if he was a king, but he was a ruler, Jannaeus, and under that particular ruler, he would have lived back in what was it, like 70 BCE or something like that. Like it's well over 100 years before Jesus supposedly lived, according to Paul in the Gospels. So I really don't understand why people use the Talmud in order to prove, in order to use it as a reference to a historical Jesus. I mean, sure, other Jesuses existed. Other Jesuses probably pissed off, people, and they were killed. The one in the Talmud did piss off people. He did have people that were following him, and the problem was that they immediately killed off all of his followers right after they killed him. So none of it makes sense in the context of the Christian Jesus.
So you're telling me we can't trust the church fathers?
No, I mean the church fathers. So in Richard Carrier's Not the Impossible Faith, he goes through and he analyzes why the church fathers believe the things that they did and whether or not they actually did historical research on their faith. None of them did whatsoever. All they did was pretty much read it and believe. That's like Justin Martyr. He was a read and believe kind of early church figure. And he directly says that in his work. So it's really interesting when I hear church fathers being brought up as like, oh, well, they claim he existed. Like Converse Contender, when I talked to him, he says that Polycarp actually studied under the Apostle John. And it's like, okay, well, these apostles would have died out in the 70s, at least, right? The 70 time frame when the Gospels were being written would be when any apostles would have been dying out. So Polycarp was born in 62. So basically he would have studied under him for a whole of 8 years. And for most of that time, he was shitting himself as a baby. I don't really find that convincing. That's not a very convincing argument to say that Polycarp studied under somebody who was an apostle, which that just means that he had a vision of Jesus. That doesn't mean that he actually met Jesus in real life. He just had a vision of Jesus. So even if you wanted to connect him to the Apostle John, that doesn't mean that he actually saw him or knew anybody that knew of Jesus.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I totally agree. I'm not certain of where that tradition comes from, but I suspect it connects itself to something Jewish there with the genealogical connections. For example, here we have to have him right to the Lord himself. And I knew someone who knew someone who, and the Gospels do the same thing. So it's hard to believe anything they claim to be eyewitness accounts. Or at least let me phrase that. Luke doesn't claim to be, but they claim to be accurate, like they know with certainty. And of course, Christians want to say these are eyewitness accounts. I don't know. Does Mark or Matthew claim to be an eyewitness account?
No, none of them claim to be eyewitnesses to it. I think the best that you can get is maybe Luke, and I mean he doesn't claim to be an eyewitness, but he does claim to do some kind of research on the information. So, but I mean even then, Luke, the author of Luke is writing like right at the end of the first century, like probably in the 90s is when he was writing. So
Being
that's going to be,
conservative.
huh?
That's being conservative, but go ahead.
Oh yeah, it definitely is. So the dates that I give, I'm trying to give like dates that that are slightly early, I guess, because I agree that Paul was written in the 70s, and then Matthew was written in the 80s time frame, and then Luke was written, I say, at the end of the first century, and that is being very generous with the dating of it, because it most likely spills into the second century when it was written. John definitely was written in the second century.
Yeah, I definitely think the dating is a big thing too. But Luke claiming to be the most accurate takes a dookie on all the other ones. I mean, he literally says, "Oh, well, listen, this is the most accurate. Technically, get rid of your Mark, get rid of your Matthew, and the 70 other gospels floating around that are later not going to make it into the canon." I'm just kidding. But seriously, he's like, this is the one. And it's funny because I'm reading Virgil and Luke right now by Dennis R. MacDonald. This is like poetry, man. This is like, let me copy some ancient pagan Greco-Roman stories and start putting it into this Jewish story. And we're going to be as accurate as we can doing so. I don't understand that.
So a good book to read is called The Mystery of Acts by Richard Purvo. He actually he shows how Luke Acts actually uses Josephus's work in order to inform his work. And then he also uses like Homer, because one of the biggest arguments for Luke being dated a lot earlier than the mainstream says is this idea of the we passages that happen around some kind of sea travel. But you see, the problem is that it only happens around the stuff about sea travel, and there's already precedent in literature at that point for using that kind of writing during sea travel, but mainly like Odysseus and or the Odyssey. Like using that as well as other works of Homer where it's a lot of sea travel going on. So he does a really good job of showing how Luke, or the person that wrote Luke Acts, used a lot of those historical, or not historical, but a lot of those literary sources in order to paint his gospel with what seems like to be like historical color. Because like he uses Josephus, and we know that we directly know he uses Josephus, because the things that Josephus gets wrong, the author of Luke Acts also gets wrong, and he gets them wrong in the exact same order as Josephus does. So that's how we know that there's a link there. So that's one avenue of how we know that it's linked. I can't remember off the top of my head what the other bits of evidence are for linking Josephus to Luke Acts, but Luke Acts definitely uses other figure or other historical writings in order to make his gospel more convincing.
Yeah, I think one of them too is the whole shipwreck. I think that might play a huge role, being they have such parallels there, and Paul's shipwreck to Rome and Josephus. Yeah.
Well, I know that the shipwreck stuff also has a huge connection to the Odyssey and other works like that from Homer. He's definitely using a lot of different sources that are not connected to Jesus at all.
So we touched on some of these, I think, extra biblical and biblical issues. And, everybody hears like the brother of the Lord. And this is a huge one, right? I'm just touching on some of these. We're just rabbit trailing, guys. We're freestyling a discussion here. Nothing is like, all right, we must make this a perfect show. It's just a discussion. But brothers of the Lord, I got this recently with Joel Pearson, because Joel Pearson comes on too and just hangs out with me. He's like, man, I don't know if they do it on purpose or if they don't mean to do it. And these aren't believers that are talking. And they're like, yeah, the brother of Jesus, James. And I'm like, pause, hold on. You're not, why are you automatically saying Jesus when it says the brothers of the Lord? And I get why, but some of the issues with that, like, do you want to bring that whole topic up or?
Yeah. So there's a lot of reasons to doubt that Paul was referencing like an actual blood brother of Jesus here. For one thing, the grammar just seems to denote that he was separating this James from the other apostle that was there, Cephas. I never know how to pronounce his name, Peter. He was separating James from Cephas. And so that's the most that you could say about that section. But then when you get into the brother of the Lord, that's actually a title that Paul uses. He uses it in another section where he's listing a whole bunch of different groups of within Christianity, and one of the groups is the brothers of the Lord. But all of this is complicated by, one, the word that he uses there when he says brother, and that's adelphos. And adelphos actually either means blood brother or blood relative, or a fictive kinship that you find in religions. So it's an ambiguous term to begin with that he uses when he could have been a lot more explicit about it. There are other words out there that are much more explicit about it being a blood kin relationship. So there's that. But then there's also the theology of Paul about this title or the familial relation that you have with Jesus once you become baptized. In several places in his work, he talks about how Jesus is the firstborn of many brethren, and he talks about baptized Christians as being baptized into the family of God, and so he becomes a brother or sister of Jesus at that point. And so, if you take all of these lines of information, and they all seem to point towards this being not a reference to a blood brother relationship, that begins to seem like it's the only possible explanation for it. There are other possible explanations, but I feel like this one's the most probable explanation for the brother of the Lord bit. And it is a very popular argument to bring up, because a lot of people think that he had a brother. But I mean, originally in Catholicism, I mean, Mary was a perpetual virgin. So I don't know why it's all of a sudden turned into, oh, well, he had a brother. Wait, wasn't Mary just a perpetual virgin? Like, she was a virgin in perpetuity.
Right.
She never had another kid until, like, I guess recently, when they were like, oh yeah, brother of the Lord. That's right.
Well, that is funny that you bring that up. I mean, why would they hold to such an idea? Your app goes into all this stuff. What else?
Yes.
I don't want to go into too much, because I think everybody needs to get the app, and it's not that bad. I mean, once you buy it, that's it, right? There's no other fees, right? It's just one time.
Oh, no, there's no ads or anything in there, and I'm actually working on a better, more updated version of the app so that you can search for things. And I'm right now, I think I've got 18 pages of information that I'm looking to add into the app. This next update that's going to be coming out. And it's all about what's coming up in the update is pre-Christian dying and rising savior deities, talking about them, their history, and how they compare to Jesus. We also have the explanation of Jesus ben Ananias, and how he connects to the Jesus of the Gospels. We've got comparisons to other historical figures in history. We've got a lot of things that are going to be coming out in this next update. And I've got a whole list of different things that I need to add to it. But I'm also working on a newer version of the app that I can build in like a search function so that you can just search for different topics. I'm hoping to put in there where you can bookmark certain topics and stuff like that. So I'm really wanting to do a lot with it so that it can be a true pocket guide and a quick reference guide for anybody that wants the information. And it has a ton of information in it. It talks about how fast, legend or myth can actually develop, with a few comparative examples of like the Roswell landing or other such events like that. It compares the mystery religion of Paul or the mystery cult, or how it all could be fabricated by comparing it to the cargo cults that popped up. It goes into all of those things. It's even got a verse by verse reference list for common arguments that people use using Paul's work as well as other portions of the Bible.
So if you wanted to antagonize, you could technically keep your little handy dandy Crestus app right there in your pocket and pull it out and just say, You said what? Hold on. Actually, did you know? And have it right there. Have it right there in your hand, so you don't have to worry about trying to figure out and remember these arguments. You already make all the arguments there, so it's easy to keep a hold of. How much is it to get that app?
Let's see. I think on Google Play it's $6.99, and I'm wanting to say that it is maybe is it $5.99 on iOS? I can't remember. Hold on. I've got all these links like in my search history because I use them all the time.
Yeah, definitely think this is cool. This is the only Mythicist app out there.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. I mean, currently it's so on Android it's $7.99, and I think on iOS it is only $6.99.
Not bad.
But if you want to go and you want to download it or you want to learn more about it, I've actually got a website for it called crest.us, which, pretty ingenious of me, I guess.
Right.
So if you want to go there, you could check it out. It's also got a blog on there. I haven't really blogged anything, but you guys can go to crest.us and you'll be able to learn about the Crestus app, and you'll be able to get to your respective platform from there as well.
I'll make sure that's down in the description, and his YouTube channel. Make sure you guys go check him out. He's always dropping some heresies, and if you like some heresies, you got to go check out John for sure. And is that you and your wife that do a podcast together?
Oh, yes. Both me and my wife, we do a podcast where we read the Bible, and then we do another podcast specifically for the members of the channel there. And it's always a fun time, especially in the Bible, because, I mean, I haven't read the Bible in a while.
Right.
I haven't read it in a while, and so it's very interesting going back through it with a very open and secular mindset rather than like a Christian mindset of, oh, well, I should read this because, I'm a Christian and that's what you need to do, kind of thing, and not being open-minded. And so it's very interesting to go through it. I always start out every podcast by recounting what we're going to be going over in the worst possible way. So the very beginning is usually pretty hilarious.
Yeah, you do. Your intro song. I wish I had that right now. I'd play. Who is that again? The young Earth creationist guy. What's his name?
Kent Hovind.
Oh man, if you guys aren't already on his YouTube, you've got to literally just go to hear this song. That's enough. I mean, you wouldn't need more. He's like debating you on something, and he says something like, "The Wells have a 15-inch penis." And you're like,
yeah. Well, no, not 15-inch, 15 foot.
Oh, okay,
it's
so
15-foot penis. Yeah. So he brought that up naturally in the debate because we started talking about evolution because it was supposed to be on whether or not a global flood happened. But of course, he loves evolution to talk about evolution. And so he started talking about whale evolution. And I was like, well, they have those vestigial hind legs back there that show that it once was a land dwelling quadruped. And he's like, are you kidding me? It's got a 15-foot penis. It's got a wag in the dark. And so it needs those in order to, in order to guide the 15-foot penis. And I'm just like, oh, I'm sorry, Ken. You cut out. What did you say?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, no, I didn't. Are you a pervert or something?
He's like, as a 15-foot penis. You look it up here. Google it yourself. But the song that you picked and the way that you chopped it up, you did like a remix on it, and he's just like, that's a 15-foot penis. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So that was actually a friend that I have over at the Mindwave podcast. They do, one of the guys there does a lot of like music mixing and EDM stuff. And so I was like, hey man, if you could give this a go, that would be awesome. And he did it. He gave it to me, and I'm like, sweet, thank you. And so now that's what I start out all of my live streams with that.
That's awesome, man. You guys can go check him out. Make sure you guys do. Hope you guys enjoyed this podcast with John. John, do you have anything else you'd like to say before we go?
Not really, other than, Jesus was most likely a myth.
And you can yeah.
Well, I was just going to say that if I could leave everybody with one particular thing, that is that if you're a mythicist, then the hypothesis is that Jesus was a myth. Try to find information out there that actually breaks that hypothesis. Don't just look at information that supports the hypothesis. Look for information that could potentially disprove it. And if you can find that kind of information, that is going to be awesome to find, and you should let people know about it. But you should also carefully consider it with what mythicists say about that particular evidence, and whether or not it actually ties to a historical Jesus. The thing is you got to critically consider it, and you got to make sure that it actually proves that Jesus existed in history. And that's what a lot of people fail with.
I agree. Make sure you guys get that app, because you keep updating stuff like that, and appreciate you joining me, brother. We are MythVision.
If you're interested in the history of early Christianity, then consider downloading the Crestus app, available on Google Play and the App Store. Crestus uses peer-reviewed sources to give you the most up-to-date scholarship on historical claims for and against Jesus. Download today to find out why the historical sources for Jesus Christ don't support his existence.